The air in the hospital didn't smell like healing. It smelled like the slow metallic decay of hope. It is a scent that clings to the back of your throat, a mixture of industrial bleach and the sharp, ozone tang of machines keeping the dead among the living. I stood in the waiting room, my reflection in the darkened window looking like a woman I no longer recognized, hollow-eyed, trembling, a ghost waiting for a body to haunt. They say the truth will set you free, but they never tell you about the price of the cage it leaves behind. They never tell you that sometimes to find the truth, you have to walk straight into a fire that intends to consume every version of you that ever existed. The shattering of the veil. The clock on the wall of St. Jude's surgical wing didn't tick. It pulsed, a rhythmic throb that echoed the pounding in my skull. It had been 6 hours. 6 hours since the sirens, since the blood on the asphalt, since the man who held the keys to my survival was wheeled through those double doors. The head nurse approached. Her scrubs were crisp, her expression a practiced mask of professional detachment. "He's still on the table," she stated, her voice as flat as a dial tone. Unexpected hurdles. Complications with the anesthesia. The words felt like stones dropping into a deep well. Complications. In this city, that was a code word for, "We're waiting for instructions." I turned to follow her, to beg for a detail, anything, but a hand clamped onto my forearm. It wasn't the head nurse. It was a younger woman, a surgical tech I'd seen entering the theater an hour prior. Her face was the color of parchment, and her eyes were wide, vibrating with a terror that mirrored my own. She pulled me roughly into the shadows of a recessed vending machine alcove, her grip bruising. "Don't listen to her," she breathed, the words tumbling out in a frantic whisper. "They're keeping him sedated on purpose. He was stable 20 minutes ago. Then the orders changed." My stomach bottomed out, a sickening lurch of vertigo. "What are you saying? He's in surgery. He needs help. He needs to wake up to testify, and that is exactly why he won't," she said, her voice trembling. "It's being orchestrated from the top floor down. The medicine, the complications, it's just the cover story for a slow execution. Someone doesn't want him speaking. Not today. Not ever." In that heartbeat, the world tilted on its axis. The sterile white hallways felt like the ribs of a predator that had already swallowed us whole. This wasn't a medical crisis anymore. It wasn't a rescue mission. It was an act of defiance against a machine so large I couldn't see the edges of it. I looked at the exit signs, the glowing red letters promising a way out, back to my quiet life, back to the safety of my own fear. I had every reason to run. I had 1,000 excuses to be a coward. I stayed. The midnight extraction. The plan was madness born of desperation. If he stayed in that bed, he was a corpse in waiting. Under the cover of midnight, when the shift change created a flicker of bureaucratic blindness, I drew a line in the sand. I wasn't just a woman anymore. I was a thief stealing a life back from the hands of the Reapers. The tech, Elena was her name, risked everything. She faked a transport order. We moved him. Not to another ward, but through the service elevators, past the laundry chutes that smelled of scorched linen, and into the back of a nondescript van I'd hired with the last of my savings. Step by agonizing step. Total silence. Total risk. Every squeak of the gurney wheels sounded like a gunshot in the muffled quiet of the hospital's underbelly. My heart was a frantic bird batting against my ribs. We reached my apartment 3 miles away. A third-floor walk-up that felt like a fortress only because no one would think to look for a dying witness in a place this small. I sat by his side for hours, the portable monitor Elena had scavenged beeping a fragile rhythmic reassurance. I watched the rise and fall of his chest, knowing that if he didn't wake up, I had simply moved a man to a different place to die. When his eyes finally fluttered open, they weren't clouded with the fog of drugs. They were sharp, crystalline with the clarity of a man who had seen the bottom of the grave and climbed back out. His voice was a ghost of a rasp, a dry rattle in his throat, but the words were steady. "They're coming to finish the job," he whispered. He didn't ask where he was. He didn't ask who I was. He knew the stakes. He had the names, the ledgers, the digital footprints of a decade of corruption. And with those 5 words, the war moved into the light. The slow burn of justice. The world expects a revolution to look like a cinematic brawl. Explosions in the streets. A dramatic showdown on a rain-slicked rooftop. But real power doesn't break that way. Real power is built on paper, and it is destroyed by the same. The climax wasn't a hail of bullets. It was a slow, methodical burn of facts. While he recovered in the shadows of my living room, we worked. We didn't go to the local precinct. We went to the federal investigators who had been hungry for a crack in the city's golden armor for years. We sent the files to 3 different news outlets simultaneously. It was a systematic dismantling of a lie that had been told for 20 years. The sirens didn't come for us this time. They came for the glass towers downtown. The depositions were grueling hours of sitting in cold rooms with fluorescent lights that made everyone look like a corpse. I watched as the crushing weight of public scrutiny began to lean against the doors of the powerful. Layer by layer, the rot was exposed. It wasn't just one bad apple. It was an ecosystem. Money. The millions siphoned from public housing. Power. The way judges were bought like cheap suits. Greed. The cold-blooded math of deciding that one man's life was worth less than a quarterly earnings report. And the architect of that misery, the man who had ordered the complications in that surgery room, watched from the back of a black sedan as his empire turned to ash. He didn't go down swinging. He went down shrinking. In the face of the truth, he looked small. He looked fragile. He looked like exactly what he was. A thief who had run out of things to steal. The ghost of Jake. A month later, I found myself standing outside the hospital entrance again. The sliding glass doors hissed open and shut, breathing the same medicinal air. But the atmosphere felt lighter. The oppressive heaviness that had sat on my shoulders for years had evaporated. The shadows were gone. The chaos had settled into a profound stillness. He had survived. The surgery, the betrayal, the aftermath. He was walking now, a little slower, a little more guarded, but alive. And as for me, I was still standing too. But as I looked at my reflection in those same glass doors, I realized I wasn't just surviving the adrenaline of that night. I was surviving everything that had happened before it. I thought of Jake. Jake, who had been the architect of my own personal rot. The man who had spent years convincing me I was small, that I was lucky to be loved by him, that the world was too dangerous for me to navigate alone. He was the reason I had lived in a state of paralyzing dread. He was the reason for the hollowed-out solitude of my 20s. For so long I thought the fear was a part of my DNA. I thought I was a person who broke easily. But standing there, in the wake of a literal conspiracy, I realized that version of me had vanished. She had died in the alcove of that hospital when I chose to stay. She had been buried under the weight of the evidence we uncovered. I wasn't the victim of a story anymore. I was the author of one. The beginning of everything. That evening I returned to my apartment. It was quiet, but it wasn't lonely. The air was sweet with the scent of a window left open to the spring breeze. I sat in the armchair by the window, the one where he had sat during those long weeks of recovery. I let my hand rest gently over my stomach, not out of pain, but out of a need to feel the steady, miraculous pulse of my own life. I whispered softly into the twilight. We made it. The words didn't disappear into the shadows. They anchored themselves in the room. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't have to convince myself it was true. I didn't have to check the locks 3 times. I didn't have to rehearse a lie to stay safe. The truth had done its work. It had burned away the empire of the corrupt, and it had burned away the shackles of my own past. Because occasionally, the universe provides a strange and terrible mercy. Occasionally, the night that breaks you, the night that strips you of your safety, your certainty, and your comfort, is the only thing sharp enough to cut you free from the life you were never meant to live. The night hadn't been an end. It had been a birth. I closed my eyes, and for the first time the darkness didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a clean slate. I breathed in deep and full, and when I opened my eyes the world was finally beautifully mine.